Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 29, Section 2, Nationalism in Africa and Asia, with a focus on South Asia for this chapter. We're going to focus on some of the events that were happening in the early part of the 20th century here. So, in return for the aid of India in World War I, Great Britain promised in the year 1917 to support gradual self-rule for India. So the question is, what does that mean? Self-rule is basically the opportunity for the people of India to choose their own government and to choose their own leaders and such, rather than having the British Crown appoint like a governor or a viceroy in this case to rule over them. Okay, but with the British, there's always complications, and one of the big complications was this issue of religious distrust. This movement was divided between the Hindus who held the majority and the Muslims who held the minority. I think the Muslim population thought that they were obviously going to get the short end of the stick, and certainly the British government was listening to this and wanted to play fair. But as a result of that, it's going to take many years to kind of find some common ground between these two different groups. And even at that, there's still some issues that are happening between Hindu and Muslims that are happening in parts of the subcontinent, even to this day. In 1919, there was a massacre of unarmed men, women, and children at a place called Amritsar. Amritsar is a very holy site for Sikhs. Matter of fact, that's where the Golden Temple is. And many of these men, women, and children had gathered for a nonviolent protest to basically call upon the British government to help them get their independence. Troops were called out, and somebody kind of lost their head and they opened fire. And the next thing we know, we have many unarmed people that are being slaughtered. And as a result of that, this is an event that really unites the people of India to kind of work together to fight the British and demand their independence. But as I mentioned before, it's going to take time. Number 4, Mohandas K. Gandhi. He was a leading Indian nationalist, basically of the early 20th century. We hear a lot about him starting in the 1920s and 30s in South Asia, but he was a man who made a name for himself really well before that period of time in South Africa when he led some different nonviolent protests to kind of help people understand the need for civil disobedience. He was a pacifist, which means he's someone who opposes the use of war or violence to settle disputes. And anyway, this whole idea for Indian independence occurred as a result of Gandhi's Quit India campaign, which was this whole idea that he was going to lead some nonviolent protests kind of help the people of India kind of unite. He and many members of the Indian National Congress were put into prison as a result of some riots that took place during this period of time. Gandhi used what is known as civil disobedience, or a method of protesting involving the refusal to obey laws that were considered unjust. Okay, but there's a little bit more to this. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this. This whole concept of basically using civil disobedience has actually got a name. It's called Satyagraha, which means truth force. Okay, and it's actually truth and polite insistence. It's really beyond being passive and resisting, but it's the idea that an individual who is going to kind of follow in Gandhi's footsteps had a lot to live up to. They had to appreciate the laws, they had to obey them basically willingly. They had to be willing to undergo some suffering and maybe even the loss of their private property, and worse yet, maybe endure the suffering that might be inflicted upon an individual's family. They had to be willing to not be attached to possessions. They had to be willing to work. They had to be willing to control their desires. They had to be fearless. They had to respect religion. Even if you were Hindu, you had to respect the Muslims or Christians or anybody who might be practicing any other faith like Sikhism or animisms. And then also to be willing to use some economic strategies like boycotts. People who were really the closest to Gandhi, they were basically showing or at least having a living faith in God. And if that meant, the Hindu gods, or if that meant a Christian God or a Muslim God in this case, so be it. But they also had to be willing to die for their beliefs. They had to abstain from, some of the vices of this world, like alcohol. Had to be chaste, and they had to be willing to, to work. And one of the things that Gandhi really got excited about is this idea of spinning. And I'm not talking about in circles. I'm talking about like spinning thread and weaving and making his own cloth. And that kind of leads us to number 7. He encouraged Indians to boycott British cloth and other manufactured goods. And as a part of his protest, he encouraged the people of India to make their own clothes. And if that meant that they didn't have much to wear, then you were to wear that with great pride. As you see in this kind of image during the March to the Sea, Gandhi is kind of wearing what looks like some baggy shorts. That is known as a dhoti, which is kind of like, I guess the best way to explain it, it's like an undergarment. And he told the people of India, even if that's the only garment that you have, you need to wear it with pride. Okay. But it's better than wearing something that was made outside of India. So in 1930, Gandhi protested a tax that had been placed on salt. Salt was made from the Sea of Bengal or the Bay of Bengal. And he led a march, 200-mile march to the sea, where the people who were protesting with him, for the most part, gathered to make salt as a way to protest the British tax. And in a way, this kind of became kind of their act of independence, which obviously the British government cracked down on and certainly thought that Gandhi had gone too far. So in 1935, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which created a constitution for India. By 1940, Muslims had called for what is known as the partition of India, so taking India and breaking it into different portions. What we're going to find is we're going to have the creation of a Hindu India and a Muslim India. The British believed that this partition would ensure stability. So in 1947, when the British rule of India ended, and we had the creation of these new countries, we had basically a Hindu India, which is like now modern day India, and the creation of 2 Muslim states known as East Pakistan, which today is now known as Bangladesh, and West Pakistan, which is kind of known as Pakistan. Not to mention the fact that you had the creation of Nepal and Bhutan as other states. This didn't really settle some of the disputes. As a matter of fact, there were Hindus that lived in basically East and West Pakistan, and there were Muslims that lived in India, Hindu India, and there was a lot of fighting that was going on, and hence we have violence that occurs after the birth of this new independent nation. Anyway, and number 11, the Muslim League, which was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Jinnah would go on to become the leader of Pakistan, but at the time when India was moving towards independence, he was really the voice calling for that separate or partition of India, leading to that birth of a Muslim nation. The first prime minister of India was actually a protege of Mahatma Gandhi. That's Jawaharlal Nehru. And one of the first problems that he had to confront was a border dispute between Pakistan and India called Kashmir. Kashmir, even to this day, is a disputed area. Matter of fact, if we go back to around the time of 9/11, there were some great concerns about what was happening in that vicinity. And matter of fact, there was talk about the fact that maybe Osama bin Laden might be hiding there. But Needless to say, this region continues to be an area of tension between the Pakistan and people of India yet to this day. All right. In January of 1948, Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu, somebody who was close to him, who thought that Gandhi had sacrificed way too much of the Hindu interest to kind of appease the Muslims, and they just couldn't tolerate it anymore, and they had him killed. Needless to say, his funeral was one of the largest funerals ever. A lot of people showed up for that. So, some comparisons here. Gandhi versus Nehru, these two men really did get along, but ideology wise, they were a little different. I mean, they were both Hindu for the most part, but uh, Gandhi had studied law in Great Britain. And matter of fact, in his younger days, he kind of saw himself as, kind of the prototypical British scholar. Um, Unfortunately, because of his ethnicity, British subjects didn't see him as that. He was raised in the upper class. In other words, he was a Brahmin. He was an intellectual. He became active in the Indian National Congress. He was nonviolent and led nonviolent protest. He was very religious and he was very traditional. Nehru also studied in Great Britain. He was also part of the Brahmin or the upper class and an intellectual, but where they differ is that Nehru was more secular. He didn't really see the importance of religion as far as how it would direct his actions. Nehru was also very pro-Western. He kind of aligned himself with Western Europe, particularly in the days right after the end of World War II and kind of the beginnings of the Cold War. And he's also considered to be very modern, whereas uh, Gandhi was kind of considered to be kind of a blast from the past. All right, thank you very much.